Number 10. Dunkleosteus, the armored predator that turned the ocean into a guillotine about 360 million years ago. Long before dinosaurs, long before mammals, long before the first forests had fully claimed the land, the shallow seas of the Devonian were ruled by something that did not need teeth to be terrifying. It was called Dunkleosteus, an armored fish built like a living weapon. Its head and upper body were covered in thick plates of bone, forming a skull so heavy and solid that fossils of it look less like the remains of an animal, and more like pieces of a war machine pulled from stone. Dunkleosteus lived in oceans where almost everything was armed. Fish wore armor. Jaws were becoming more powerful. Predators were learning new ways to kill. But even in that brutal world, Dunkleosteus stood apart. It could grow to the size of a small car, and its head alone tells the story of an animal designed around impact, pressure, and cutting force. The soft parts of its body rarely fossilized, but the armored skull survived, and the skull is enough. Instead of teeth, Dunkleosteus had sharp, bony plates. These plates worked like shears. When the jaws closed, the cutting edges sliced against each other, sharpening themselves through use. It did not bite like a shark. It did not tear like a crocodile. It closed its mouth like a guillotine. Every feeding strike maintained the weapon. Every victim helped sharpen the next kill. But here is where the violence becomes even stranger. Studies of its jaw mechanics suggest that Dunkleosteus could open its mouth with incredible speed. That motion may have created suction in the water, pulling prey toward the mouth before the victim could react. A smaller armored fish swimming nearby may not have experienced a chase at all. It may have felt the water vanish in front of it, dragging its body forward into the plates waiting to close. The bite force was immense. Estimates suggest the pressure at the front of the jaws may have been strong enough to crush and slice through armored prey. In a sea full of creatures protected by bone and shell, Dunkleosteus evolved a weapon built to defeat armor itself. Being hard did not save you. Being plated did not save you. The ocean had produced a predator that could cut through the defenses the rest of the world was relying on. The fossil evidence makes the story worse. Paleontologists have found regurgitated masses of broken bone and armor associated with these ancient ecosystems. These are not heroic hunting scenes reconstructed from imagination. They are leftovers. Dunkleosteus appears to have eaten with such force and aggression that indigestible fragments of its victims were expelled back into the water, where they settled into sediment and fossilized. Hundreds of millions of years later, the remains still tell us what happened after the bite. That detail is what turns Dunkleosteus from impressive to disturbing. A predator can kill. A predator can feed. But here we have evidence of an animal processing armored bodies so violently that the broken pieces of prey became geological records of its appetite. The stone does not preserve fear, or blood, or the moment of impact, but it preserves the aftermath, shattered skeletons, bitten armor, and the waste of a feeding machine that ruled before land vertebrates had even become dominant. For millions of years, Dunkleosteus occupied a world that no longer exists. The continents were different. The seas were different. The animals it hunted belonged to vanished branches of life. Then the late Devonian extinction struck, and the armored placoderms disappeared. Dunkleosteus left no modern descendant. Nothing alive today is truly like it. Its entire lineage ended, leaving only fossil skulls and the evidence of what those skulls had done. That is why Dunkleosteus belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It was not a monster in the mythological sense. It was worse than that. It was a real animal shaped by evolution into a self-sharpening killing apparatus, patrolling seas where the rules of survival were written in armor and force. The victims are gone. The ocean is gone. The ecosystem is gone. But the plates remain, still locked in stone, still shaped like tools made for cutting. Dunkleosteus did not leave behind a legend. It left behind the fossil record of a sea where even armor could be sliced open. Number 9. Smilodon, the saber-tooth that turned the throat into a target around 12,000 years ago across the grasslands and woodlands of Pleistocene North America. There lived a predator whose entire body seemed designed around one violent act. Smilodon fatalis was not simply a big cat with long teeth. It was a specialized killing machine built for close-range power, ambush, restraint, and a final bite delivered to the softest part of a large animal's body, the throat. The most famous feature of Smilodon was, of course, the canines. They could extend around 7 inches beyond the upper jaw, curved like blades and flattened more like knives than the round stabbing teeth of modern cats. These were not ordinary fangs made for gripping. They were cutting weapons. But those teeth created a problem. To use them, the animal needed a skull and jaw capable of opening far wider than any living big cat. Smilodon could open its jaws to an extreme angle, far beyond the gape of a lion or tiger. Its lower jaw moved almost out of the way, clearing space for the long canines to descend into flesh. The whole skull looked as if evolution had redesigned it around the moment of impact. The bite was not made for a long wrestling match. It was made for a precise, catastrophic wound. That wound was likely delivered to the throat. Modern lions often kill by suffocation, clamping down on the windpipe or muzzle, and holding until the prey weakens. Smilodon seems to have used a different method. After overpowering or pinning prey with its muscular forelimbs, it could drive the saber teeth into the neck, slicing through soft tissues, blood vessels, and airway. A successful bite would not take minutes. It could end the struggle in seconds. That is what makes Smilodon so brutal. It did not need to crush bone. In fact, its saber teeth were too specialized to be risked carelessly against thick bone. They were tools for the vulnerable gap beneath the jaw, where hide, muscle, artery, vein, and breath all passed close together. The prey animal may have been massive, armored by size and muscle, but the kill still depended on one fragile opening. Smilodon hunted the weak point built into every living body. The prey was not small. Pleistocene North America was filled with heavy animals: bison, horses, camels, ground sloths, young mammoths, and other large herbivores. Many were far larger than a single cat. This is why some researchers have suggested Smilodon may have hunted in social groups, or at least benefited from group living in some contexts. Whether alone or together, the animal had to get close enough to control prey that could break bones with a kick or crush a predator beneath its weight. The fossil record shows that danger clearly. Brea Tar Pits have preserved hundreds of Smilodon remains, many with injuries, broken bones, healed trauma, damaged limbs, and signs of survival after serious wounds suggest these cats often lived through violent encounters. The throat slash may have been fast, but getting into position was not safe. Every kill required entering the danger zone of animals much larger than itself. That is why the saber-tooth is often misunderstood. It was not an overpowered fantasy monster that simply stabbed anything it wanted. It was a predator trapped by its own specialization. Its teeth were extraordinary, but fragile if used incorrectly. Its body was powerful, but built for close combat. Its killing method was devastating, but only after the prey had been brought under control. Smilodon lived by a tactic that was both brilliant and risky: restrain the giant, find the throat, and finish the fight before the fight could destroy you. Then the Ice Age world changed, the great herbivores declined, ecosystems shifted, human expansion, climate change, and collapsing megafauna populations transformed the landscape Smilodon depended on. A predator so specialized for large prey could not easily become something else. When the world of giant herbivores disappeared, the throat-slashing cat disappeared with it. That is why Smilodon belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. Its violence was not random, it was anatomical. The 7-inch blades, the impossible gape, the powerful forelimbs, the reinforced neck, the injured fossils from Brea, all of it points to a life built around a few seconds of catastrophic damage. The saber-tooth did not just kill, it evolved around the act of opening the throat, and for thousands of years, across the Ice Age plains, every large animal lived with the possibility that death would arrive, not as a chase, but as a shadow, a grip, and 2 curved knives, cutting into the place where breath became blood. Number 8. Tyrannosaur cannibalism. When the apex predator ate itself about 66 million years ago, in the floodplains and forests of western North America, Tyrannosaurus rex stood at the top of the food chain. It was the animal almost everything else had to fear. A multi-ton predator with bone, crushing jaws, serrated teeth, powerful legs, and a skull built to absorb the force of tearing flesh from massive prey. In the popular imagination, T-Rex is the final threat, the monster at the top, the creature nothing else could challenge. But the fossil record tells a darker story. Some T-Rex bones carry bite marks made by T-Rex teeth, not scratches from small scavengers, not damage from weathering or shifting sediment. Deep grooves, punctures, and drag marks that match the spacing and shape of tyrannosaur teeth. The marks appear on bones from the same species, meaning at some point, Tyrannosaurus rex was feeding on Tyrannosaurus rex. That single fact changes the entire image of the animal. The apex predator was not outside the violence of its world. It was part of it. A dead tyrannosaur could become meat for another tyrannosaur. A wounded tyrannosaur could become opportunity. A rival, a mate, an old individual, or perhaps even a younger one could end up inside the jaws of the only animal powerful enough to break it apart. The conservative explanation is scavenging. A tyrannosaur dies from injury, disease, starvation, or age. Another tyrannosaur finds the body and feeds. In nature, nothing wastes a large carcass. Meat is meat. Bone marrow is fat. Predator does not stop to ask whether the dead animal shared its species. In that version, the cannibalism is brutal but practical, a fallen giant becoming calories for another giant. But the bones leave room for a darker possibility. Some bite marks appear in ways that make the behavior feel more violent than simple cleanup. They show force, they show repeated contact, they show an animal with jaws strong enough to gouge into the bones of its own kind. Whether those bites came after death or during a fight that became fatal, the implication is the same. T-Rex lived in a world where its own species could become its greatest danger. That is what makes tyrannosaur cannibalism so disturbing. Most ecosystems have a top predator, but even apex animals usually have some kind of safety built into their status. A lion fears injury, hunger, or rival lions, but it is rarely food for another animal. An orca has no natural predator in the modern ocean. A great white shark may dominate its waters until something even larger appears. But for T-Rex, the top of the food chain curved back on itself. The thing at the summit was still vulnerable to another thing at the summit. Imagine a young tyrannosaur growing into that landscape. It had to hunt, avoid injury, compete for food, survive disease, and navigate a world full of other predators. But the most dangerous shape on the horizon was not always a different species. It might be an adult version of itself. Larger, older, stronger, hungry enough to treat another tyrannosaur as meat. The violence between tyrannosaurs may also have gone beyond feeding. Many tyrannosaur skulls show signs of face, biting healed injuries, and trauma consistent with fights between individuals. These animals may have bitten each other during dominance contests, mating competition, territorial disputes, or battles over carcasses. Some survived those encounters long enough for the bone to heal. Others may not have. The fossil record preserves both the wound and the possibility of the final meal. There is something uniquely grim about that. T-Rex was not simply a predator of duck-billed dinosaurs, horned dinosaurs, or armored prey. It also belonged to a species capable of turning its own dead into food and its own rivals into victims. The crown of the ecosystem was not a place of peace. It was a place of constant competition, where the strongest jaws on land could close on anything, even another tyrant. That is why tyrannosaur cannibalism belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It strips away the clean idea of the apex predator as untouchable. T-Rex did not live above the rules of hunger. It lived inside them more completely than almost anything else. The bite marks remain, carved into fossil bone across tens of millions of years, proving that even the king of the dinosaurs could end as a carcass in another king's mouth. The apex was not safety. It was only the highest point from which to fall. Number 7. Kronosaurus. The sea monster that ate other sea monsters about 120 million years ago. The shallow seas covering what is now Queensland, Australia, held a predator built on a scale that modern oceans no longer understand. It was called Kronosaurus queenslandicus, a short-necked pliosaur with a skull nearly as long as a small room, jaws filled with spike-like teeth, and a body designed to drive that skull through water like a battering ram. If a great white shark is the terror of the modern imagination, Kronosaurus belonged to a world where even sharks would not have been safe. This was not a graceful predator. It was not built for elegance. It was built for impact. The skull alone could reach enormous proportions, with teeth that functioned less like knives and more like massive puncture tools. They were conical, curved, and strong, made to grip, crush, and hold prey that was itself large enough to be dangerous. A modern ocean predator usually sits above fish, seals, or smaller marine animals. Kronosaurus hunted in a sea where the prey could be another monster. That is what makes the Cretaceous ocean so brutal. The food chain had levels above levels. Plesiosaurs, marine turtles, large fish, sharks, and other reptiles occupied waters already filled with predators. But Kronosaurus stood above them, a predator capable of attacking animals that would have seemed untouchable in almost any other ecosystem. It was not merely eating fish. It was eating the animals that ate the fish. The fossil evidence shows the violence clearly. Crushed shells, damaged vertebrae, and bones from marine reptiles bear injuries consistent with enormous bite force. Turtle shell that could resist most predators could be cracked. A plesiosaur that ruled its own part of the water column could be punctured, broken, and dragged apart. The first bite from Kronosaurus may have been enough to decide the encounter. With jaws that large and teeth that deep, precision became less important than contact. If the skull reached you, the fight was probably already over. Imagine the attack from below. A long-necked marine reptile moving through warm, shallow water, a turtle crossing open sea, a large fish turning too late. Beneath them, a dark shape accelerating upward, not with the sleek speed of a dolphin, but with the force of a living, battering ram. Then the jaws open. A skull the length of a table arrives from the darkness. Teeth like spikes close into shell, bone, muscle, and lung. The ocean fills with movement, then pieces. What makes Kronosaurus especially disturbing is that its world had no modern equivalent. Today, the ocean has large predators, but the upper tier is thinner. An orca is terrifying, but it lives in a world humans can recognize. Kronosaurus lived in a reptile sea, where air-breathing monsters hunted other air-breathing monsters, where even reaching the surface to breathe could expose an animal to attack from below. The water column was not just dangerous, it was layered with danger, and the ecosystem had to support it. A predator that size cannot exist in an empty sea. It requires abundant prey, and not small prey. Large calorie, rich animals capable of feeding a giant. That means the Cretaceous waters of Australia were packed with enough marine life to sustain a creature that could crush other predators for food. The existence of Kronosaurus is evidence of an entire ocean built around violence at scale. This is the part the bones cannot soften. A 20-foot marine reptile would be a monster in the modern world. In the world of Kronosaurus, it could be prey, armor, size, speed, and predatory status did not guarantee survival. The only rule was whether something larger had found you first. Then, like the rest of the great marine reptiles, Kronosaurus vanished with the ancient seas that made it possible. The ecosystems changed. The oceans were reshaped. The reptile predators that once dominated them disappeared, leaving no living equivalent to show us what that food chain felt like from inside the water. All that remains are skulls, teeth, crushed bones, and the paleontological evidence of a sea where giants ate giants. That is why Kronosaurus belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It reminds us that the ocean was not always ruled by sharks, whales, or familiar predators. Once, the top of the sea belonged to reptiles with jaws, powerful enough to destroy other monsters. Kronosaurus did not haunt the Cretaceous ocean as a myth. It hunted there as an animal, and for anything swimming beneath that ancient Australian sea, being huge was not protection. It was only enough meat to attract something worse. Number 6. The Tully Monster. The creature that died by the thousands without a name about 300 million years ago, in the warm coastal waters that once covered what is now Illinois, there lived an animal that still refuses to fit comfortably into the tree of life. It was small, soft-bodied, and strange enough that when its fossils were first found, even museum experts did not know what they were looking at. The creature was eventually named Tully monstrum gregarium, better known as the Tully Monster. The name sounds almost playful. The fossil is not. Tully Monster fossils come mostly from the Mason Creek deposits, one of the most important fossil sites in North America. There, inside ironstone nodules, soft-bodied animals were preserved in astonishing detail. Creatures that should have rotted away were sealed quickly enough to leave impressions of their forms. And among them, again and again, appears the same impossible body. A long, soft shape, a pair of eyes on a rigid bar, and a flexible trunk, like appendage ending in a small clawed or toothy mouth. There is nothing alive today that looks exactly like it. There may be nothing extinct that looks exactly like it either. Scientists have argued for decades about what the Tully Monster actually was. Some have suggested it was related to lampreys or other vertebrates. Others have argued it was an invertebrate, perhaps closer to worms, mollusks, arthropods, or something stranger. The debate has not fully ended. That alone makes the animal haunting. Thousands of fossils, and still no final place to put it. But the atrocity is not only that the Tully Monster is mysterious. It is how many of them died. The Mason Creek fossil beds preserve Tully Monsters in huge numbers. They do not appear as one lonely accident. They appear again and again, as if entire populations were struck down and sealed into the mud. Soft-bodied animals usually vanish quickly after death. For so many to fossilize, conditions had to shift fast. Oxygen had to disappear. Sediment had to cover them. Decay had to be slowed before scavengers and bacteria erased the evidence. What survived was not a peaceful cemetery. It was a series of mass death events. One possible cause is anoxia, oxygen collapse in the water. In a stagnant lagoon or estuary, oxygen levels can drop until animals simply suffocate. A creature like the Tully Monster would have had no defense against that. There would be no predator to fight, no wound to escape, no direction to flee if the entire water column turned hostile. The environment itself would become the killer. The animals would struggle in water that no longer gave them what their bodies needed to live. Another possibility is salinity shock. Mason Creek may have been a coastal environment where fresh water and seawater mixed. A sudden flood of fresh water, or a sudden change in salt concentration, could have overwhelmed animals adapted to a narrow chemical range. Their bodies would fail, not because they were attacked, but because the water around them changed too quickly. For soft-bodied creatures, chemistry can be execution. That is what makes the Tully Monster mass death so disturbing. There is no chase, no bite, no dramatic predator. There is only a population trapped inside an environmental collapse. Thousands of strange animals dying together in water that became unbreathable or chemically wrong, then being buried quickly enough that their bodies pressed into stone. Their final moment was not preserved as motion. It was preserved as outline, and those outlines still do not explain them. The Tully Monster died in numbers large enough to become famous, but not clearly enough to become understood. Its fossils are common enough to be the state fossil of Illinois, yet its identity remains contested. We have more individuals of this animal than we have of many dinosaurs. And still we cannot say with certainty what kind of creature it was. It is as if extinction preserved the body but erased the category. That is why the Tully Monster belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It represents a different kind of violence from the jaws of Dunkleosteus or the teeth of Smilodon. It is the violence of water changing against life, a whole habitat turning lethal, a population dying in pulses, creature entering the fossil record by the thousands and still remaining almost nameless. The Mason Creek nodules still crack open today with Tully Monsters inside them, their stalked eyes staring outward, their strange mouth extended, their bodies flattened into ancient stone. They died 300 million years ago in waters that no longer exist, on a coastline that has vanished from the map of the world. And even now, after all that time, science can look at them and say only this with certainty: something lived there, something strange, and then the water killed it. Number 5. Brea Tar Pits. The death trap that fed on hunger in the middle of modern Los Angeles, surrounded by streets, museums, traffic and buildings, the ground still leaks black death from the Ice Age. The Brea Tar Pits look almost unreal today. Dark pools bubbling slowly beneath the California sun, asphalt rising from deep underground, thick enough to hold anything unlucky enough to step into it. But for tens of thousands of years, these pits were not curiosities. They were traps. and they killed with a patience no predator could match. The mechanism was simple. Oil seeped upward through the ground and collected at the surface. Lighter chemicals evaporated, leaving sticky asphalt behind. Dust, leaves, and rainwater could cover the surface, making the pit look like ordinary ground or a shallow pool. An animal would walk toward it, perhaps thirsty, perhaps careless, perhaps following a familiar path. One hoof broke the crust, then another. The asphalt gripped the legs. The animal pulled, struggled, panicked, and sank deeper. For a trapped herbivore, there was almost no escape. A bison, horse, camel, ground sloth, or young mammoth could thrash for hours or days, but the tar did not tire. It did not need to bite. It did not need speed. It only needed the victim to keep fighting. The more the animal struggled, the more the trap tightened. Hunger, exhaustion, dehydration, and fear did the rest. But here is where Brea becomes truly brutal. A trapped animal in the open is not silent. It cries, it kicks, it attracts attention. And in the Pleistocene landscape of Southern California, attention meant predators. Dire wolves came in packs. Saber-tooth cats came for an easy kill. American lions, coyotes, short-faced bears, vultures, eagles, and scavengers followed the sound and smell of helpless meat. They arrived expecting food. Instead, many stepped into the same trap. That is why the fossil record at Brea is so unnatural. In a normal ecosystem, herbivores vastly outnumber carnivores. Predators are fewer because they depend on the prey population beneath them. But Brea reverses the pattern. The pits contain huge numbers of carnivores, especially dire wolves and saber-tooth cats. The trap did not just catch prey. It used prey as bait. One struggling herbivore could pull in predator after predator, then scavenger after scavenger, until the pit had consumed an entire chain of hunger. This was not a single catastrophe. There was no asteroid, no eruption, no flood. Brea operated slowly, repeatedly, for thousands of years. The same process happened again and again. A large animal became stuck. Predators gathered. Some fed from the edges, some pushed too close, some fought each other. Some were injured by the dying prey, some sank. Their bodies became bait for the next wave. The pit reset itself through appetite. The evidence is overwhelming. Millions of fossils have been recovered from Brea. Dire wolves, Smilodon, mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, ground sloths, birds, insects, plants, and microfossils. Together, they form one of the richest Ice Age fossil records on Earth. But that richness came from suffering. Every bone in the asphalt is not just an animal that died. It is part of a trap that turned an ecosystem's instincts against itself. What makes the pits so unsettling is their silence. Predator kills because it is hungry. A volcano erupts because the earth breaks open. But the tar pits killed without intention, without hunger, without anger, without even movement. They simply existed. Life walked over them and was taken. The pits did not chase the Ice Age world. They waited for it to step too close. And many of the victims were the very animals we imagine as dominant. Smilodon, the throat-slashing cat, ended in the tar. Dire wolves, powerful social hunters, ended in the tar. Short-faced bears and American lions, animals that terrified their landscapes, could still be reduced to struggling bodies in black asphalt. At Brea, strength did not matter once the ground had you. That is why the Brea Tar Pits belong among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. They were not a battlefield, but they preserved the casualties of one. The battle was between instinct and geology won for tens of thousands of years. Hunger brought the predators. Panic held the prey. The asphalt held them all. Today, the pits are surrounded by a city that barely resembles the Ice Age world above them. But the tar still bubbles, the ground still exhales. And beneath Los Angeles, packed in black petroleum, the bones of predators that came to feed on trapped prey still lie together, proof that sometimes the deadliest hunter is not an animal at all. Sometimes it is the ground itself. Number 4. Neanderthal cannibalism at Goyet Cave. The relatives who became food around 40,000 to 45,000 years ago inside a limestone cave in what is now Belgium. The bones of Neanderthals were left behind with marks that are impossible to make gentle. Goyet Cave had already preserved remains from a vanished human world, stone tools, animal bones, traces of occupation, and fragments of people who were not quite us, but close enough that their DNA still survives in many modern humans. Then archaeologists looked closely at the Neanderthal bones themselves, and the cave changed from an ancient shelter into something much darker. The bones had been cut, not randomly, not by weather, not by animals chewing after death. The marks were made by stone tools, placed exactly where a butcher would cut to remove muscle from bone. Long bones showed percussion fractures, the kind created when bones are struck open to reach the marrow inside. Skull fragments showed defleshing marks. The pattern matched the processing of animal carcasses found in the same layers, reindeer, horses, and other game. The Neanderthal bodies had not only been buried, they had been butchered. That is what makes Goyet so disturbing. The people doing this understood bodies. They knew where the meat was. They knew how to separate tissue. They knew how to break bone for fat, rich marrow, and they applied that knowledge to members of their own kind. The cut marks on Neanderthal bones were not treated as special or sacred in the way we might hope. They resembled the marks on the animals they hunted. Cannibalism is always difficult to interpret in the archaeological record. It can happen for many reasons: starvation, warfare, ritual, humiliation of enemies, treatment of the dead, or survival during crisis. But marrow extraction gives the Goyet evidence a brutal practical edge. Marrow is food. It is dense, valuable, and worth the effort when calories matter. To crack a femur open is not symbolic in the abstract. It is the act of someone seeking what is inside, and the evidence becomes even darker. Some Neanderthal bone fragments from Goyet appear to have been used as tools after the bodies were processed. They show wear consistent with retouching stone edges, pressing bone against flint to sharpen or shape a tool. That means the dead may have been transformed twice, first into food, then into equipment. A bone that had once belonged to a person became part of the workshop of the living. The image is hard to escape. Cave group cuts flesh from a Neanderthal body. They crack open the long bones. They take the marrow. Later, a fragment of that same body is picked up and used to maintain the edge of a stone tool. The boundary between relative, meal, and object collapses into one archaeological layer. This does not mean Neanderthals were monsters. That would be too easy, and probably wrong. Neanderthals cared for injured members of their groups. They buried some of their dead. They made tools, used pigments, hunted dangerous animals, adapted to harsh climates, and survived for hundreds of thousands of years. The Goyet evidence does not erase their intelligence or emotional lives. It reminds us that intelligence and brutality can exist in the same species, and not only in them. What makes Goyet more unsettling is that it is not entirely alone. Other Neanderthal sites in Europe have produced evidence interpreted as cannibalism or intensive processing of human remains. The behavior may not have been universal, but it was possible under certain conditions. Neanderthals ate Neanderthals. Whether through hunger, ritual, violence, or a mixture of motives, the result is preserved in bone. And because Neanderthals are so close to us, the distance collapses. This is not the cannibalism of some alien creature. These were human relatives who made fire-shaped stone, cared for the injured, and shared ancestors with us. Some of their genes remain in living people today. The hands that made the cut marks belong to beings close enough to look back at us from the edge of humanity. That is why Neanderthal cannibalism at Goyet Cave belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It shows a past where survival, death, hunger, and identity did not always fit our comforting categories. A body could be kin, a body could be meat, a body could be a tool. The cave did not preserve a story with names or motives. It preserved the cuts. And in those cuts, still visible after 40,000 years, we see one of the darkest truths of prehistory. The line between human and horror was never as clean as we want it to be. Number 3. The Toba supereruption. The winter that almost erased us about 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the earth opened with a force almost impossible to imagine. The event is known as the Toba supereruption, and it was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. This was not a mountain releasing smoke and lava in a familiar disaster. It was a planetary-scale wound, an explosion so large that the volcano collapsed into itself and left behind the enormous caldera, now filled by Lake Toba. The ash did not stay local. It crossed oceans. It fell across South Asia. In parts of India, volcanic ash from Toba formed thick layers that still exist in the ground today, a grey geological scar separating one ancient world from another. Beneath the ash, life continued as it had before. Above it, the planet had changed. But the eruption itself was only the beginning. The real catastrophe came from the sky. Toba blasted huge quantities of sulfur dioxide, ash, and fine particles into the atmosphere. These particles could reflect sunlight, disrupt climate patterns, and cool the planet. The result may have been a volcanic winter, a period when temperatures dropped, seasons changed, rainfall patterns shifted, and ecosystems already balanced on narrow margins began to fail. For early humans, this would have been more than bad weather. It would have been a collapse of expectation. Plants that were normally available may have disappeared. Animals may have migrated or died. Water sources may have changed. Hunting routes, gathering grounds, and seasonal knowledge built over generations could suddenly become unreliable. A species that depended on memory of the landscape was forced to survive in a landscape that no longer behaved normally. This is where Toba becomes one of the darkest events in human prehistory. Some researchers have argued that the eruption may have contributed to a severe human population bottleneck, reducing the number of breeding humans to a dangerously small level. The exact severity remains debated. Not every archaeologist agrees that Toba nearly erased Homo sapiens, and some sites show signs of human survival across the ash layer. But even the debate itself reveals the scale of the event. Toba was large enough to make scientists ask whether our species came close to ending. Think about what that means. If the bottleneck theory is even partly correct, then every human being alive today descends from survivors who made it through one of the most dangerous climate shocks our species ever faced. Not warriors, not kings, not famous ancestors. Small groups of people enduring hunger, cold, uncertainty, and ecological collapse in a world without writing, agriculture, medicine, or permanent cities. There is no record of what they experienced. No myth can be securely traced back to the ash. No voice tells us what the sky looked like when the light dimmed, or what it meant when familiar plants failed, or how many groups vanished without leaving descendants. The only testimony is geological. Ash in the soil, chemistry in ice, genetic patterns in living people, and archaeological layers that show humans standing at the edge of a disaster they could not understand. That is what makes Toba so brutal. It was not a predator that could be fought. It was not an enemy that could be avoided. It was the atmosphere itself turning hostile. Early humans could not negotiate with it, outrun it, or kill it. They could only endure. Those who found food lived. Those who did not disappeared, along with every story, skill, name, and memory they carried. And the margin may have been terrifyingly thin. If a few more groups had failed, if cooling had lasted longer, if key refuges had collapsed, the entire future of humanity could have ended before civilization began. No pyramids, no cities, no languages written into clay or carved into stone, no history. Only scattered bones beneath a layer of ash, left for some other species to discover. That is why the Toba super-eruption belongs among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It was not an atrocity committed by humans. It was an atrocity committed by the planet's own geology, a volcanic winter that may have forced our species through a narrow gate of survival. We do not remember Toba, because no record survived from the people who faced it, but we may carry its aftermath in our bodies, in the genetic narrowness of a species descended from those who did not die. The lake is calm now, forests grow around it, boats cross the water, but beneath that beauty is the crater of a disaster that may have nearly ended the human story before the story had even learned to speak. Number 2. Chicxulub. The day the sky turned to fire about 66 million years ago, a rock from space crossed Earth's orbit and did not miss. It was roughly the size of a mountain, moving at a speed no living creature could comprehend. It struck the shallow sea near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and released more energy than any weapon humans have ever built. The impact site is now called Chicxulub, and its buried crater is one of the largest scars on the planet. For the animals alive that day, there was no warning that could matter. The asteroid entered the atmosphere in seconds. It hit with such force that rock, seawater, and sediment were vaporized and blasted upward. The crust itself was punched open. The ocean was displaced. A crater more than 100 miles wide began forming in moments. Everything near the impact zone was simply erased by heat, pressure, shockwave, and water moving with impossible violence. Then came the fire from above. The impact threw molten material high into the atmosphere. Those fragments did not stay there. They fell back toward Earth across the planet, re-entering like countless tiny meteors. As they burned through the atmosphere, they released heat on a global scale. For animals standing beneath the open sky, the air itself may have become deadly. Forests ignited, the horizon glowed. The world did not burn from one place outward. It burned from the sky down. This is what makes Chicxulub so brutal. A normal disaster has direction. A flood comes from the water. A fire comes from the trees. A predator comes from the grass. But after Chicxulub, danger came from everywhere at once. Shock waves, earthquakes, falling debris, burning air, collapsing forests, and ocean waves taller than landscapes. There was no safe direction to run if the sky itself had become part of the catastrophe. The tsunamis were monstrous. The asteroid struck a shallow sea, and the displaced water radiated outward in waves that crossed ancient coastlines with unimaginable force. Marine life was thrown, buried, crushed, and scattered. Coastal ecosystems were torn apart. In some fossil deposits, animals appear to have died in the immediate aftermath, buried with impact debris that fell through the water and entered their gills. The disaster was not only global, it was precise enough to catch creatures in their final minutes. But the worst part came after the fire. Dust, soot, sulfur, and vaporized rock entered the atmosphere and blocked sunlight. Photosynthesis collapsed. Plants died. Plankton died. Food chains failed from the bottom upward. The animals that survived the impact, the heat pulse, the fires, and the waves then faced a colder, darker planet where food was disappearing. Survival became a slow starvation lottery. Being large became a disadvantage. Needing constant food became a death sentence. The non-avian dinosaurs could not survive that world. Neither could the pterosaurs, the ammonites, many marine reptiles, and countless other branches of life that had dominated Earth for millions of years. The catastrophe did not kill every individual instantly. Some died in minutes. Some died in days. Others lasted months or years in a broken world. But the system that supported them had ended. When the dust settled, roughly 3/4 of Earth's species were gone. The Mesozoic world, which had lasted for more than 180 million years, was over. The great dinosaurs that had ruled land ecosystems vanished, except for one surviving branch: birds. The survivors were often small, adaptable, burrowing, aquatic, or able to eat many kinds of food. Our own distant mammal ancestors survived, because they were not the giants of the world. They were small enough to hide in its ruins. That is why Chicxulub belongs near the top of the prehistoric atrocities, too brutal for the history books. It was not only an extinction event, it was the sudden execution of an entire planetary order. A world of giants was dismantled in an afternoon, then finished by years of darkness. The asteroid did not hate the dinosaurs. It did not target them. It simply arrived, and the rules of life on Earth changed before the planet had completed another turn. The crater is buried now. Forests grow above parts of the scar. Cities exist near the edge of the wound. Birds sing in a world made possible by the destruction of their ancient relatives. But beneath the Yucatan, the impact ring remains, silent and enormous, marking the day the sky turned to fire, and the age of dinosaurs ended not with a battle, but with a collision. Number 1. The Great Dying. When Earth almost killed everything about 252 million years ago, long before dinosaurs ruled the land, the planet entered the worst catastrophe life has ever survived. It is called the Permian-Triassic extinction, but the name is too clean for what happened. A better name is the Great Dying. This was not a normal extinction event. It was not a reshuffling of species or a difficult transition between ages. It was the closest Earth has ever come to becoming a planet of ghosts. The numbers are almost too large to feel real. Around 96 PHNTRM of marine species disappeared. Around 70 PHNTRM of land vertebrate species vanished. Even insects, the most resilient and numerous animals on Earth, suffered the only major mass extinction in their history. Coral reefs collapsed. Forests failed. Ocean ecosystems broke apart. Entire branches of life ended so completely that nothing like them ever returned. If Chicxulub ended the age of dinosaurs, the Great Dying almost ended the age of complex life itself. The cause was not a single impact from space. It was slower, larger, and in some ways more terrifying. In what is now Siberia, a vast volcanic province known as the Siberian Traps began erupting. But this was not one volcano exploding and then stopping. Lava poured out again and again across enormous areas, covering millions of square kilometers with basalt. The eruptions released staggering amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds, and toxic gases into the atmosphere. The planet began to cook. Temperatures rose. Rainfall patterns changed. The chemistry of the atmosphere shifted. The oceans absorbed carbon dioxide and became more acidic, making it harder for marine organisms to build shells and skeletons. Warming reduced oxygen in seawater. Deep oceans became anoxic, meaning they lost the oxygen complex life needed. Then the dead zone spread. A sea without oxygen is not just empty, it is hostile. But here is where the nightmare becomes almost unimaginable. As oxygen collapsed in the oceans, sulfur-loving bacteria may have expanded through the water. These microbes produce hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas deadly to many forms of life. In some reconstructions, parts of the ancient seas may have turned into poisoned water, releasing gas into the air and damaging the ozone layer. The ocean was not merely warming, it was becoming chemically dangerous. Imagine the worst stage of that world. Forests dying on land. Rivers carrying eroded soil into seas where reefs had already collapsed. Oceans turning acidic and low in oxygen. Coastlines poisoned. Heat spreading across continents. Animals moving toward survival zones that were shrinking year by year. The sky filled with volcanic gases from eruptions that did not stop on any human timescale. That slow duration may be what made it so brutal. An asteroid kills with a single strike. The Great Dying killed by changing the rules of Earth itself. The air, the sea, the temperature, the chemistry, the food chains, everything life depended on was altered. Species could not simply run from it. They could not migrate far enough if the oceans themselves failed, if the tropics became unlivable, if food webs collapsed across the planet. The fossil record after the extinction is haunting because of what is missing. Diversity drops, ecosystems simplify. Disaster species dominate where rich communities once existed. The world did not bounce back quickly. Recovery took millions of years, not centuries, not thousands. Millions for longer than the entire existence of the human genus. Earth struggled to rebuild the complexity it had lost. That is why the Great Dying belongs at number 1 among the prehistoric atrocities too brutal for the history books. It was not a predator attack, not a cannibal cave, not a tar pit, not even a single sky fire impact. It was the near collapse of the biosphere. The planet's own geology overloaded the atmosphere, poisoned the oceans, and pushed life toward the edge of total failure. And yet, a small fraction survived. From that fraction came everything after. Dinosaurs, mammals, birds, flowering plants, primates, and eventually humans. Every living creature today descends from lineages that passed through the narrowest gate in the history of complex life. We are not simply the heirs of life's success. We are the descendants of a world that almost ended. The Siberian traps are quiet now. The seas are blue again. Forests returned. Animals filled the land, but buried in rock across the Permian, Triassic boundary, is the evidence of Earth's darkest biological moment. Empty oceans, broken ecosystems, vanished lineages, and a recovery so long it makes human history look like a blink. The Great Dying is the final warning from deep time. Life is powerful, but it is not guaranteed. And once, 252 million years ago, the planet came terrifyingly close to proving that.